Today we're talking about square roots and cube roots. When I look at a square root, it reverses a square. So, for example, if I'm looking at the square root of 64, I'm trying to figure out what number times itself gives me 64. The answer would be 8. When you have a square root, and it's got a plus or a minus sign in front of it, that means that they want both the positive and the negative square root. So if we looked at this as just being a 121, what number times itself gives you 121? The answer is 11. So if we had a 1 and 21 hundredths, we would be multiplying 1 and 1/10 times itself to get us that. One like number 3 would be the square root of 25 over the square root of 36. So really it would just be 5/6. There's no plus or minus, so we can leave it like that. This next one is tricky. Unfortunately, there is no number that I can multiply by that will give me a negative 16. I can't multiply two negatives or two positives, because a negative times a negative is a positive, and a positive times a positive is of course a positive. The only way to do it is to get a negative times a positive, and we can't do that. So this one is considered no solution. You can't multiply one number by itself to get a negative. What if they want to know what should be under the radical? What they're saying here is if I have the 3 as being the answer, what is going under the square root? So the square root of what number gives us 3? The answer would be 9, because 3 times 3 is 9. What number would be under the square root or under the radical sign to give us 10? So 10 times 10 gives us 100. Remember, this radical sign is a non-negative square root. The only way that it becomes negative is if you see this plus minus sign out in front of it. Otherwise, we assume it's positive. Okay, try these for me, and I'll be back in just a second to show you the answers. Okay, make sure that you have paused the video. Now let's check it with a red pen. Okay, the first step is to remember, hey, I can't have that negative in front of the 100, so this one's a no solution. Here, I want both the positive and the negative, and my answer would be 9/10. Here, I'm taking the square root of 9, which is 3, and the square root of 16, which is 4, and I'm getting 3/4. 7 times 7 gives me 49, so I know that my answer here is going to be 7. 6 times 6 gives me 36, so if I wanted to find the number that goes under the radical, it would be 36. Here, 9 times 9 gives me 81, so the reverse of that, if I put the square root of 81, does in fact equal 9. What about cube roots? Cube roots are asking us what number times itself 3 times gives us this number. So when I'm looking at the number 27, I'm trying to think, okay, 2 times 2 times 2, no, that gives me 8. So down here, this one's going to be 2, because 2 times 2 times 2 gives me 8. However, 3 times 3 times 3 does in fact give me 27. So this one equals 3. What number times itself 3 times gives me 64? The answer is 4, because 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. What if we're looking here to figure out what number would go under the radical but would give us 8? So these are actually easier for me, because all I know that I have to do is just multiply 8 times itself 3 times, and we get 512. For the 6, I would do the same thing. 6 times itself 3 times, which would give me 216, so that goes under the radical. Why don't you try these for me, and I'll be back in just a second to show you the answer. This one's trickier. Remember, you're going to break it apart first. All right? Grab your red pen. Let's talk about these. So the square root of, or excuse me, the cube root, I should put cubes here, I'm sorry about that, of 27 is 3, and the cube root of 125 is 5. What number times itself 3 times gives us a negative 64? If I have a negative times a negative times a negative, it does in fact equal a negative. So negative 4 times itself 3 times will give me a negative 64. That works for cube roots. It does not work for square roots. What number times itself 3 times gives me 1,000? The answer is 10. All right, over here, we know that the negative 64's cube root is 4, so the positive 64's cube root would be positive 4. Here, we would take 9 times itself 3 times and get 729, and we know that would then be the cube root. So, what is a perfect cube or a perfect square? I merged those two together. So, we are going to classify these as being either perfect squares or perfect cubes or both. So, if we look at 4, 2 times 2 gives us 4. Is there any number that I can multiply by itself 3 times to give me a square of 4? The answer is no. So it's a perfect square, but it's not a perfect cube. The idea behind it is that it has to be an integer for it to be perfect. So what about 27? We know 3 times 3 times 3 gives me 27. So it's a perfect cube, but if we take the square root of that, it's really close to 25, which is 5, but 6 times 6 gives me 36, so it's in between those. So it's a perfect cube, but not a perfect square. If we look at 1, 1 times itself gives us 1, so that's a perfect square. But if we multiply it again, it's actually also a perfect cube, so it fits in both. So 1 would go here. What about 85? If we take 85 and we think about it, it's between 81 and 100, which are both perfect squares, so it's not a perfect square. But if we take But if we look at 16 and we take 2 and we cube it, that gives us 8, and 3 cubed gives us 27, and it fits in between there. So he is only a perfect square. All right, see what you can do with these. I'll be back in just a second to show you where they all fit. Okay, so 9 is a perfect square, but is not a perfect cube. 216 is a perfect cube, but is not a perfect square. 64 is magical and is both, because if you take 4 and you cube it, you get 64. And if you take 8 and you square it, you get 64. 35 is the tricky one. He is neither. 25 is a perfect square, but is not a perfect cube. And 125 is a perfect cube, but is not a perfect square. And that's all I've got for you. We'll see you next time.